In the summer of 1281, Kublai Khan sent the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen toward Japan. Not a fleet, an armada. 4,400 ships. 140,000 men packed so tight they could barely move. Enough wood and iron to build a city, enough soldiers to fill it twice over. And every single one of those men believed they were sailing to a conquest that was already decided. They were wrong. On the night of August 15th, something happened in the waters off Kyushu that no general, no emperor, no shipwright could have planned for or prevented. The wind came. And by morning, most of those ships and most of those men were gone. There are a few things about this story that I want to tell you up front, because they change everything. First, many of those 4,000 ships had no keels. They were riverboats, flat-bottomed, built for calm water, dressed up to look like warships. Someone lied to Kublai Khan about what he was sending his men to sea in. Second, the Japanese had been waiting for this invasion for 7 years, and the wall they built to stop it still exists today, buried in the sand of Kyushu's coastline. And third, the storm that destroyed that fleet gave birth to a word. A word you already know. A word that came back into the world 7 centuries later, painted on the fuselages of Japanese pilots who were never going to come home. That word is kamikaze. And almost nobody knows where it actually came from. But to get to the storm, you have to understand the man who built the fleet. Because Kublai Khan was not the kind of person who accepted the word no, and Japan had been saying it to him for years. By 1270, Kublai Khan was the most powerful ruler on earth. That is not an exaggeration. The empire he had inherited from his grandfather Genghis stretched from the Pacific coast to the edge of Eastern Europe, a landmass so vast that riding across it from one end to the other would take years. China had submitted. Korea had submitted. Persia paid tribute. The Abbasid Caliphate was dust. Kublai sat in his capital at Kanbalik, the city that would one day become Beijing, and looked east across the Korea Strait at a chain of islands that had not yet answered his letters. He had written to Japan's rulers 3 times. Polite at first, then less polite, then something closer to a threat dressed in diplomatic language. Japan did not reply. Not once. Whether it was arrogance or genuine indifference, we will never know, but the effect on Kublai was the same. He stopped writing letters and started building ships. The first invasion came in the autumn of 1274. 900 vessels. 23,000 soldiers. The Mongols landed at Hakata Bay on the northern shore of Kyushu, and the Japanese samurai who rode out to meet them got the worst shock of their lives. They had trained for centuries in a tradition of single combat, calling out your name before you charged, finding an opponent worthy of your blade. The Mongols fought nothing like that. Tight formations. Coordinated volleys of arrows. Exploding bombs. The samurai were cut apart before they could get close enough to swing. But then the weather changed. A typhoon came in off the sea that night and hit the anchored Mongol fleet hard, sank about a third of the ships, drowned somewhere around 13,000 men. The survivors pulled back to Korea. Kublai Khan heard the report in silence. He had lost men. He had not lost interest. He simply decided that next time, he would send more. The Japanese knew he was coming back. That was never really in question. So they spent the next 7 years building a wall. It ran along the entire western shore of Hakata Bay, the most likely landing point for a second invasion. 2 meters high, 20 kilometers long, made of stone blocks hauled down from the mountains. Every samurai family in the country contributed to it. Men who had never touched a stone in their lives learned to work as laborers. The Japanese had looked at what happened in 1274 and drawn a conclusion that must have been painful for a warrior culture to accept. Honor, skill, and courage were not going to be enough. The wall might be. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Korea Strait, Kublai Khan had solved a problem that had limited him before. He had just finished conquering the Song dynasty of southern China, and the Song had something the Mongols had never possessed, a real maritime tradition. Shipwrights, harbors, timber reserves, sailors who had been going to sea for generations. Kublai absorbed all of it and turned it toward one purpose. The order went out: build a fleet large enough to drown Japan beneath it. And here is the part of the story that historians still argue about. The deadlines Kublai set were impossible. The quotas for ships were enormous. And somewhere in that rush, between the orders and the shipyards and the foremen who needed to show the Khan that progress was being made, something went badly wrong. Many of the vessels that rolled out of those yards were not ocean-going ships. They were river craft, flat-bottomed, without keels, designed for the Yangtze and the Yellow River where the water stays calm. They had been built in a hurry, and some of the timber had been recycled from older, worn-out boats. They looked like warships. They were not warships. And nobody told Kublai Khan. Or maybe someone did, and he did not listen. We have no way to know. What we know is that by the spring of 1281, 4,400 ships were waiting in the harbors of Korea and southern China, and 140,000 men were preparing to board them. The plan called for a two-pronged assault. The Eastern Fleet, 900 ships out of Masan in Korea, 40,000 troops, would sail first and apply pressure on Hakata Bay. The Southern Fleet, 3,500 ships from the Chinese ports, 100,000 men, would follow and meet them off the coast of Kyushu. Together they would be unstoppable. That was the theory. The Eastern Fleet arrived in June and immediately ran into the wall. The wall the Japanese had spent 7 years building along every viable landing beach. The samurai behind it were not panicking. They had been waiting for this. The Mongols dropped anchor offshore and sent word to the Southern Fleet, "Hurry up. We cannot land alone." Then they waited. 7 weeks. In summer. In ships packed with tens of thousands of men. The water supply dwindled. Food rotted in the heat. Disease moved through the fleet the way it always moves through confined spaces, fast and without mercy. And every night, while the Mongols sat anchored and helpless, the Japanese came out to them in the dark. They had developed a tactic for exactly this situation. Small boats, 2 or 3 men each, no armor, just swords and fire. They would row out from shore without torches, navigate by starlight between the anchored Mongol ships, board the ones they could reach, kill whoever they found, and set the hulls alight before the alarm went up. Then slip back into the darkness. The Mongols could not pursue them without lighting up their own ships as targets. They could not even retaliate effectively without risking the vessels around them. Night after night after night, ships burned. Men died. And the Eastern Fleet, which had arrived with its morale reasonably intact, was becoming something else by the time the Southern Fleet finally appeared in August. 100,000 fresh soldiers. 3,500 more ships. On paper, the invasion force was now overwhelming. In reality, the Eastern contingent was already worn down, short on supplies, and haunted by something they could not name, the particular dread of men who have been sitting still for weeks in enemy waters, waiting for something to happen. Something was about to happen. Now here is what I want you to hold on to as we get to the storm itself, because this next part is not just a military disaster. It is a mystery that went unsolved for 7 centuries. For all that time, the story of what happened to Kublai Khan's fleet existed as legend, Japanese legend, Chinese legend, Mongol silence. It was only in our own lifetime, when divers went down into the water off Takashima Island, that anyone found out what the sea had been keeping. On August 12, the 2 fleets joined near Imari Bay. 4,400 ships in one place. The assault on the Kyushu coast was scheduled for August 15. The Japanese, watching from behind their stone wall, could see the masts from shore, not individual ships but a line of wood along the horizon, as if the ocean had grown a forest overnight. The emperor in Kyoto ordered the nation's priests and monks to pray, not for victory in battle, for weather. On the morning of August 15th, the sky changed color. It went gray-green in the south, the way it does before a serious storm, a color that Pacific sailors learn to recognize early in life and do not mistake for anything else. The wind picked up through the morning hours. By early afternoon it was strong enough to drag at the anchor lines. By evening the bay had become something you would not want to be in any ship, let alone a flat-bottomed river boat with no keel and recycled timber in its hull. The smaller vessels went first. They rolled and did not come back up. The larger ships held for a while, until the bay became so chaotic with wind and current that they started drifting into each other. 4,000 ships in a confined space, in a typhoon, in the dark. The collisions became catastrophic. One ship strikes another, breaks its anchor line, drifts into a third. Hulls that were never built to flex in open water began to splinter. Masts came down. Men who went overboard in the darkness had no realistic chance in seas like that. The ones who tried to swim for shore were often killed by the samurai before they reached the beach. The storm lasted 2 days. When it cleared, the surface of the bay was covered in wreckage for as far as anyone could see. Between 70,000 and 100,000 men were dead. The estimates vary because nobody survived to count them accurately. 80% of the fleet was gone. The ships that remained turned for Korea. Most of them did not make it. The men who washed up alive on Japanese beaches were hunted down over the following weeks. Of the 140,000 soldiers who had set out, only a fraction ever went home. Kublai Khan received the news and, according to the Chinese records, was enraged. He began planning a third invasion almost immediately. It never happened. The cost had been too great, his advisors too frightened to approve another fleet of that scale, and the shipwrights of southern China apparently unwilling to repeat what they had already built once. He died in 1294, still, as far as we know, thinking about Japan. The Japanese had a name for what had saved them: kamikaze, divine wind. And from the moment that name was given, it stopped being a description of a weather event and became something else, a theological fact. Japan had been protected, not by its armies, not by its wall, but by the gods of the islands themselves, who had looked down at 140,000 Mongol soldiers and sent a typhoon. This was not a metaphor to the people who lived through it. It was literal, and for 7 centuries it shaped how Japan understood itself, as a place set apart, watched over, impossible to conquer from outside. The kamikaze became part of the national identity in a way that few historical events managed to do. Shrines commemorated it. Children learned it. It became the kind of story a culture tells itself when it needs to believe it cannot be broken. And then came 1944. The American Navy was advancing toward the Japanese home islands. The losses in the Pacific had become catastrophic, and the Japanese military command was looking for a way to slow the American warships that they could not match in conventional battle. Someone, and historians still debate exactly who, reached back into that 7-century-old story and found the word. Kamikaze. Divine wind. If the storm of 1281 had saved Japan by destroying an invading fleet, perhaps young men in aircraft could do the same. The pilots who volunteered, and many of them did volunteer, though the social pressure to do so was extreme, were told that their sacrifice was not death. It was a continuation of something sacred. They were the wind this time. They wrote letters home. They flew. Most people today know the word kamikaze only from those pilots. They have no idea the word is 700 years old. They do not know it was born in a storm. They do not know the storm was summoned, if you believe the old accounts, by the prayers of an emperor who had nothing left to do but ask the sky for help. The word traveled from 1281 to 1944 and arrived meaning something entirely different from what it started as, and the original event has been mostly forgotten. For a long time, the kamikaze story existed only in documents. Japanese chronicles, Chinese dynastic records, a handful of Mongol accounts that tend to avoid dwelling on the defeat. Historians could reconstruct the outline of what happened, but the fleet itself was gone, scattered somewhere on the floor of Imari Bay, under 25 meters of water and centuries of sediment. Then, starting in the 1980s, Japanese and international archaeologists began diving off Takashima Island. And they started finding things. Ship timbers, still holding their shape after 700 years, preserved in the anaerobic mud of the bay floor. bronze helmets, iron anchors that would have required dozens of men to move, personal objects, bowls, weapons, a stone seal carved with a name we cannot trace to anyone in the records. The kind of things that fall out of a man's hands when he goes into the water and does not come back up. But the most significant discoveries were structural. When the scientists analyzed the construction of the wrecks, they found exactly what the historical sources had hinted at: ships that had been built in haste, with the wrong hull shapes for open water sailing, fastenings that were substandard, timber that in some cases had clearly been salvaged from other vessels. The kamikaze had not sunk an invincible fleet. It had finished off a fleet that was already compromised. The miracle of 1281, if you want to call it that, was assisted by the corruption and panic of a shipbuilding program that nobody had been honest about. And yet, the timing. The storm arrived on the exact day the assault was planned. Not a week earlier when the ships might have fled to open water, not a week later when the soldiers might have already been ashore. August 15th, the day of the attack. Whether that is divine intervention or the cruelest coincidence in military history depends entirely on what you already believe, and the sea is not going to tell you which one it was. 4,400 ships. Most of them never came home. 140,000 men, and the sea took the majority of them in 48 hours. And a single word, kamikaze, that started as a prayer answered by a typhoon and ended as the name painted on planes flown by boys who knew they were not coming back. The wall is still there, in the sand at Hakata Bay, if you know where to look. The wrecks are still there, under the water off Takashima, still giving up pieces of themselves to the divers who go down. And in the Yuan Dynasty archives in Beijing, the records of what was lost that August are written out in numbers so large they read less like history and more like an inventory of the end of something. Was it the gods? Was it the weather? Was it the men in the shipyards who built riverboats and called them warships and said nothing? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to Hidden History Vault and hit the bell. The next one is already coming, and I think it will surprise you. This has been Hidden History Vault. The past never stops speaking.